Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from True Parley Grandmaster Foot. It's Life Beyond the Invisible Wall and the Meaning of It All. Hope you'll enjoy listening. The invisible wall is this concept we've been talking about in a series of your Parley about the frontiers of video game design. In fact, in this Parley, we're going to read the quote that started this series, so let's just do that right now, and I think that'll be a great way to introduce you to what these are about. So this is from a Game Developers Conference talk with Yoko Taro, the creator behind the Drakengard Nier series given back in 2014. Yoko Taro says, quote, "I strongly believe that there's still a huge potential for games beyond the invisible wall." Let's take a look at this. There's an image I'm putting up for you. It's a very simple image. This shows the space potential games could occupy. So on the outside, you have things you just can't do. This refers to things such as expressions that are not allowed ethically or simply unattainable due to costs. For example, there's a limit as to how far we can go with sexual expressions, and I will never have a chance to work on a game that costs $100 million. Just Zandy cutting in for a second here. Both of those are literally not impossible, though. And in fact, I think as for the $100 million, I wonder how his opinion about that has changed. But obviously there will be things like you want to create a virtual reality game of a sort, and we just don't have that technology yet. Like you cannot, as far as we know, physically create that right now. Obviously there are games that you cannot currently make. In the grand scheme of things that you could never currently make, I'm not sure about that, but there's certainly impossible games to make. Continuing. Now, the spoiler for the Nier series that we won't tell you, something in those games, isn't crossing any ethical lines and is doable within cost. However, it's not something that is currently commonly done when making games. Someone said this thing from the Nier games took one step into the zone where games should not go. Maybe so, maybe that's what falls into this gray zone here, the unknown. In other words, in between things you can do and are done commonly, and that you literally can't do, there exists a gray and fuzzy zone where you're unsure if you can do it. Within the cost and time allowed, we are making games intelligently, and at the same time, certain sorts of rules and standards have been set in place. Rules like games must be played for a certain amount of hours, or gameplay needs to be fun, or the story needs to move people, assumptions. This leads to what we could call the invisible wall. The invisible wall is defined by the games we create within these rules and doesn't allow for anything else. But is this really true? Isn't there more we can do? For example, say there was a full-price box game that lasted 10 minutes. No one would ever approve this, but what if? What if those 10 minutes were the most beautiful 10 minutes you could experience here on Earth? Or another example. A game no human can clear. Or another one, an item you can only get by chowing down 10 Burger King Whoppers in 10 minutes, like in real life. Just thinking about these things, these ideas, makes my heart beat. With cholesterol from the 10 Whoppers. Yoko Taro finishes, excuse me, "I sense that there must be a lot of emotional peaks that are possible on the other side of the invisible wall." So, right, the idea is that there are games of convention, and then there's games that we kind of can't currently make, but in between them, there are games that won't often be made, or gameplay mechanics or ideas for games that won't often be used, but which we could use. It's just for whatever reason people aren't currently. Sometimes this can be because of conventions about the culture at the moment. This could be because of values that may shift over time. This could be because of a perception that other people won't enjoy them. For example, I think a lot of artists would like to make something that is along the lines of, you make the most beautiful 10 minutes you could experience here on Earth, or you make an attempt to do that. It's just that most audiences will likely not sign up for that for any meaningful cost. And I think it's worth discussing why. They're probably right not to, but that doesn't mean it's a bad idea. We'll get into that a little bit later, though. That's the prompt for this series. It's been a series of Parley about the frontiers of game design, about where you could go and where games that are trying to say something and do something new and different might be going. Not where the games industry as a whole is going, where maybe more meaningful games from the industry are going. Sure. Mr. Fruit begins, "Welcome to the final episode of this little series of Parley. There is one big question left to answer as we sit here on page 65 of this shared Google Doc that you put them all in. Why this? Why this topic? Why bother with this strange topic? Well, I certainly think it's interesting, in case that wasn't clear after 20 Parley on the subject. But to explain why, I believe that I have to go back to what inspired it one last time. So a brief history of the past. I won't get into the details, but playing Nier Automata has had a profound impact on the trajectory of my life. That is what made it my favorite game. I tried really hard to understand why it had had that profound impact. I consumed many interviews with its creators, I had watched people attempting to analyze it, and I've spent countless hours thinking about its every aspect. One of the things that really stood out to me among this sea of mental input was the GDC talk titled Making Weird Games for Weird People by the game's head writer and creative director Yoko Taro, containing that quote that we opened the series on and which I just read you again. There are two things about that quote that stood out to me. First, there is the concept of emotional peaks. I can only speak for myself, but emotional peak is the perfect description of what I'm looking for in art. I'm all about the big moments where the elements of a story pay off, come together, and reset your expectations for what's coming next. The second one is the description of this invisible wall, this idea that there is art that could be made, but there is something preventing us from going there. That there is an invisible wall standing between us and the audience. In that talk, Yoko Taro says that we should try to explore what is beyond the wall. And once again, I can only speak for myself, but when I reflected on the games that had impacted me before Nier, games like The Stanley Parable, The Beginner's Guide, BioShock, and the Metal Gear series, they all had this one element in common. They were all going beyond the invisible wall in one way or another. So in conclusion, life is easy. Just find the games that go beyond the invisible wall, and you'll experience the greatest emotional peaks art has to offer, right? Well, that is a thing I, Mr. Foot, believed in the past. I don't believe it anymore. The connection between emotional peaks and the invisible wall is more complex, after all. And to understand that connection, we have to talk about the final boss. Of all questions in discussions about art, it's a question that I have avoided for the entirety of this series, even though Zandy here has not. We have to ask, what makes art good? Oh no. And to be more accurate, we have to ask what makes art good, because I, little stinker that I am, have derailed the conversation to discuss this previously. So really, what is the final boss is multiple of us talking about what makes art good at the same time. If I can just control everything and say it's this, bada bing, bada boom, we move on, then it can seem simple, and I hope it didn't when I've done that in past Parley in this series. I will say what I think about that over the course of this Parley. But this time we're going to focus more on, it is when you are weighing in on this subject more heavily than in the past. Great, I'm glad we got there at the end. By the way, I'm delighted to see that in this Parley. So, we've got some setup before we go on that journey. It's helpful to think about what makes art good, because then we can evaluate the status of the invisible wall as an ingredient or whatever correlative factor in good art. You know, what does making art that is beyond what is maybe typical, and there's some sort of human barrier between making it and not, but it is possible to make. What is the relationship between that and good art, whatever that means? Well, it seems like we need to come to some ground that's usable about what good art is, if we're going to talk about that. So, very well, that's just what we'll do. I think that the useful takeaway from earlier as well is to unpack emotional peak briefly again, as we have many times in the series. I think these are really mercurial things, and I think that's a key point here. Yes, obviously people have a temptation to say, well, the reason there's no point analyzing what makes art good is because it's subjective. And that is not untrue, but just because it is not perfectly exact doesn't mean we can't analyze it. And indeed, I think that most of the reason that people think of art as being this like mysterious mercurial thing is that they just give up on analyzing it. The moment they get to the point where they feel like they can't prove that it is something or something else. But why? Who cares? We don't have to prove it. To have useful, helpful ideas, creating a useful thought tool does not require that we prove that it is correct, just like how we don't have to prove that a hammer is the best tool for a situation to know that if you're going to build something, it's useful to bring a hammer. It's still obviously useful, and it would be silly to argue it isn't most of the time. even though we aren't exactly sure what exactly we'll use it for in a given situation. It's like having a screwdriver in a multi-tool. That's not a very big guess. Just because it is a guess doesn't mean that that's like silly or something. Really, in human definitions in general, we just have to get close enough and it'll be useful. After all, if we think we can guarantee something, we don't really know that. We don't know for sure it'll be useful. We don't know for sure that an assumption or a scientific test we run is correct. There could be things we don't fully understand, and most people are way too quick to assume that they have some information and therefore this is just correct anyway. Humans just like things being tidy and neat like that, but you don't have to. I don't really anymore. Let's just let it be messy and accept that, yeah, we can probably say some good things about the nature of art being effective without being able to prove that it is good. That just doesn't matter, really. That's interesting to think about, but it's not like a lost cause just because we can't do it perfectly. It's completely fine. We can totally dig into that. And it's the same with emotional peaks, but I think it's really important to look at the kind of target here. If the target is an emotional peak, these experiences where it's almost like you can see yourself changing, is when you have these sort of emotional impact experiences. It's useful to break down the materials that they are made of. And I think this is where my previous theorizing about the contents of art and goodness in art is useful. So I'm going to say that quickly now. What I had been setting up in previous Parley is this idea that it's more useful to focus on the audience and the art as two components that work together to create a good experience. And it's important for emotional peaks because when the audience gets something out of a work of art, there's a way to view it as an exchange of their experiences, materials which they have, which allow them to engage with the art, and then the kind of ride that the art puts them on if they have those materials. Another way to think of it could be that it's something like an obstacle course, but you need certain skills or like a mountain bike or something to be able to navigate the trail. And so when a piece of work is more specific and possibly has a more interesting, in a certain way, obstacle course for you, it often in exchange involves more materials or life experiences, perspectives you have come to understand, etc. And I think that viewing those, I guess, perspectives as being something you kind of collect as you go throughout your life, not as a one thing that you just have, but as things you accumulate over time. And therefore, as you mature, that's kind of what maturity is. You simply have more perspectives, not more perspective necessarily, more perspectives, plural. You have had more ways of thinking. And I think this is how you can meet people that have experienced a lot in life, but are mysteriously much less mature than other people. Sometimes people who have experienced less in life, because it matters that you care about, hold on to those experiences and not do what a lot of people do, which is view them as like, this is just my personality now. Well, it's a personality that you gained, but you don't have to throw out the other stuff. I feel you're sort of meant not to throw out that other stuff if you want the benefits of this perspective, which I think it's valuable. You could very reasonably want the benefit of those perspectives. So go figure, but the point is, those materials and then hooking up with, what the piece is going to do. The key thing is, pieces of art can be better or worse at telegraphing materials they might want you to have, tutorializing them. Maybe the piece of art can give you some of the materials during its duration, or maybe even all of them, without requiring too little of those materials. That is, still a relatively ambitious and specific work of art may be able to do most of the setup for you during its duration without it being like boring or cumbersome to do that. Maybe in some cases. If you've never lost a loved one and it needs to set up a big emotional payoff later that involves that, you might be able to just see a character in the book lose a loved one, and then you to an extent have a little bit of that perspective now. And so maybe then later parts of the book will work without requiring you to already have that material. Then if you already have it, that part of the book is maybe rendered a little is that then a good idea? But so you can see how the trade-off works. The problem here is that for many people, it's piecemeal, right? Imagine a book or a movie or an anime or a game or whatever that you liked, a painting. Imagine some of the things, perspectives you've had, things ways you thought about it, or things you'd felt in your life that allowed you to be able to enjoy that. So for a video game, it might be experience with that type of gameplay previously. It could be a language that you understand. It could be something as simple as you had the time to play it, or at an interval that you enjoyed. You know, you were able to binge it and you thought that was more fun, for example. I think a lot of anime is significantly of different quality depending on whether you watch it weekly or in bursts. We talked about that in a previous parlay. So you have those materials, right? And you can imagine that for most people, they don't have none of those materials, but they also don't have all of those materials. Not that many people have the same ones or a similar set as you, but also very few people have nothing in common with the perspectives you have. They're both uncommon. And so a work of art mostly kind of guides that loose 75% of the way there set of materials to a finish line where you have a meaningful emotional experience. I hope you can see the issue here. It's not very linear. It's not very clear. So which ones are more important? I mean, if not everybody has every single one, no person is the exact perfect fit to experience a work of art, then how does this work? How do you determine, what amount of those pieces is important or useful? And this is where I think analyzing it from the audience's perspective loses its power. As you put at the beginning of your discussion, that certain something, Mr. Foot says, approaching it from the side of the audience is easy, in principle, if affecting you is what makes it good, by your definition. But this answer lacks an actionable element for the artist. Right. Sure, that might be what you do to appreciate a work of art and experience it being good. But we don't have a way to say that something about the art makes it good. All I did in my description was explain how humans find art to be good from the human side of the discussion. You may then decide that you feel that there isn't anything about art that makes it good, but you can really easily say some things that make art a little more likely to be good. Again, we're not going to get an exact answer, but it's going the opposite way. Extremely easy to get a very vague answer. For example, it's pretty ridiculous to suggest that you can't do anything to make art more accessible. You obviously can. And so you definitely can't completely not answer what makes art good on the art side. Just because we can't exactly answer that, in all likelihood, just doesn't matter that much, according to me. I think we can still go further. So the question now is, let's rephrase it. What did the people who made the good art have in common? What kind of thing makes a human able to make art that people will find good? We can try to do it reverse, sort of. Tackle it from the opposite direction. I, Mr. Foot, have struggled with this question for the better part of a decade. We all know good art when we see it, well, but it's hard to put into words. Okay, you're losing me. Oh, no, it's fine. It's a difficult question, and any answer that works for me might not work for you. All right, yes, we're in agreement. I found my personal answer when I started wondering what art is in general. And my answer is that art is two things. It's having something to say, and it's investing the effort into putting that thing out there. And following that logic, good art would then be doing those things well, having something good and important to say or interesting, and investing a lot of effort into getting that message across in a way that other people can understand. Now, I want to be clear, both the intensity of the effort and the value of the message cannot be measured. That's not what we're trying to do here. Effort is not the X hours invested. Maybe intention is a better word here. We'll unpack that. That part does not matter. It's not that more time or effort is what we're saying. You need to invest a large amount of effort, money or time, into getting that message across. That's not what we mean. And it's not that the details of the one true thing the author has to say are important. That also doesn't matter and arguably don't exist. So we need to unpack these a little bit. Right. So the two things that make art are something to say and this intention to put it out there. Let's unpack them a little bit and then try to translate into then good art. And then how does that connect back to humans experiencing it as good? That's the plan. I know this is sort of a complicated parlay. This is the last one. We made a lot of progress. So the wanting to say something. I would say this is a little simpler than it sounds. This is just the art has a direction, a purpose. You would be surprised how many professional or aspiring to be professional game developers, let's say, have hired employees, have crowdfunded money, have begun developing a game without knowing what they want to make, without having anything they want to make. In fact, I would say, simple though it may be, it's just you have something specific you actually want to do. It's actually very difficult to have that, in my humble opinion. One of the reasons is that most people think they do have it, but then if they actually go through the steps of making a game, they will find that for many of the actual questions behind making this piece of art, or a game in this case, they don't actually have an answer for that thing. Like, what will the gameplay be? Why that gameplay, for example? It takes effort to have an opinion about that. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. An intentional opinion that actually does something. And so there is the second part, that intention bit. This is how I'm going to describe it, is that the work is, it's not the amount of effort. It could take very little effort. It's not the amount of money, obviously. It's how intentional the effort is almost what I want to say. The way I would think of it is, because it's not about the scope of the game at all. So it's what percent of the game is trying to fulfill the goal of the game. So what percent of the art is for the purpose of fulfilling the goal of the art. The art has something to say, or a specific target to depict or show to the audience. What percentage of the art is trying to do that thing versus like something else? I think examples will help. You make a painting. How much of the painting is to depict the emotional response you want to elicit versus a limitation of your technique or budget or time, or you were distracted by another theme and maybe that wasn't elegantly woven in, or maybe it was, that could be better. Does that maybe make more sense? And so in a game, this is a pretty common problem. I would argue this is one of the big weaknesses of games as an art form on the ground, like in practice, is that it's much rarer for a game to have a high percentage of its content be united in delivering its message, partly because games less often have a like single or fewer creators, which means it's harder to have a united message. You can imagine that if 100 people make a game, most of the stuff made in the game isn't made by someone who knows the goal of the people making the game, or whose own goal is taken into consideration by everybody else. That's very difficult to do. And even if you have a director that everybody listens to and is uniting the goal of the project, they need to be able to clearly express that. They need to have it, and then they need to be able to tell everybody. You can see how that's very hard. A skill issue if you want to be completely highfalutin about it, but to say it that way makes it sound anything but one of the hardest things you can do as a human being. So yeah, it's challenging. But then also there's thinking about what game mechanics do in games. I think a big problem with video games here is that a lot of the time the creator does like intentionally as such put the mechanic in. Like they did mean that mechanic. They thought about making the mechanics other things and they chose this one. Sounds good. But the problem is they haven't fully understood what the, I guess, psychological effect of that mechanic is on the player, and have not used it in a way that is sort of player facing to create an experience that will reliably, coherently push the player toward their intended goal. Just as a simple example, if you make a fighting game, it can be pretty difficult to remove your own experience making, and I hope then playing, fighting games, and make a fighting game that is applicable to people who are not the skill level you are. That's very challenging. I would love to learn more about how the hell people do that. And there is some of the, you can do it, there's some of the how to write someone smarter than you kind of thing. There's a whole bunch of ways you can approach that subject. That's very interesting. But you get my point. It's not always easy to think about game mechanics and then just accurately understand roughly what their impact will be on players. That's an additional step that I think often gets somewhat overlooked. This gameplay mechanic doesn't just automatically mean this to a large percentage of players. And often the devil's in the details. Do turn-based combat fights make the game relaxing because it's not in real time, or a slog because they can feel grindy? Well, it could all depend on small quality of life issues that keep the combat moving quickly. I've played some games that do pretty amazing work with that, and which don't, where there's very little difference except how quickly you move in and out of those fights. And that completely transforms how that part of the game feels. So just as an example, finally that element is undervaluing elements that kind of shove the game into feeling one way or another. Even if you intentionally choose the mechanic in theory, often it's kind of mean. You don't get credit unless you get it almost exactly right. Because if you do something slightly wrong, then engaging with that mechanic will also be a drag and therefore get in the way of the intended experience. Even if once it isn't a drag, it does further the intended experience. Very cruel, but it's hard to make a good game. So go figure. Great. So then a game that is good would be a game that has a coherent thing to say, and I would argue it's basically specific. I think that's reasonable. If a game is going to have something good and important to say, well, what does that mean? Well, not vague, basically. And to an extent, I would say, like doing parlay like this. To make the parlay good, one of the most basic things I need to do is stay focused on the core topic, which can be hard when it's a 40-minute parlay where the text is from a 65-page Google document. I'm not blaming you. I'm just saying it is challenging for both of us. And you've done a pretty good job keeping this one on task. Hopefully I'm doing okay so far. I think this is going pretty good. The way to view an art piece as being good then is that it is relatively specific. I would argue that's basically what good and important means here for the thing the art has to say. And then that the pieces of the art percentage-wise mostly work toward that goal or a relevant goal, rather than not working toward a relevant goal. Again, a lot of the time it might not actively impede the player, but it will just not directly help, and so it's sort of a waste of time rather than furthering the goal of the game. Most often in video games, this is that the game includes something typical of the genre or that is like trending or popular in a lot of games without really thinking about whether it helps with the game's message, and this invariably makes the game worse, except for the people who are acclimated to the game by familiarity a little bit more. But as you gain experience with media, you will not need that to increasing degrees. So I do think it dilutes it, it's fair to say. But lots of art is a compromise like that. I'm going to refer to this second quality of the piece of art having its effort expended toward it be intentional as the art piece being united. I think that's helpful. So it's that the art has something specific to say and that it is united in saying that thing or those things, basically. It's about what it is. Surprise, that's better. I hope now you can see if maybe not everybody would agree with this definition, but I think a very wide variety of people would, hopefully. Mr. Foot says, I'd like to introduce one final concept, and that is the idea of emergence. Interesting. For decades, science has progressed by taking problems and breaking them down into smaller, more fundamental problems. And that's worked beautifully, but nowadays we stand before problems where we try to put the parts back together, and the larger system behaves in ways that can theoretically be explained by the fundamental forces, but not practically. Something emerges from the simple fundamental interactions. This exists in all fields, be it the climate, consciousness, or the economy. Our understanding has become sufficiently complex enough that, in other words, we can explain every process in your body by explaining every chemical reaction that happens in each and every cell of your body. But in practice, that doesn't get us any closer to understanding what kind of person you are. I believe that this same concept of emergence also happens with art. We could analyze the billions of small hints and interactions that make up the effort, care and intention behind any given piece of art, and we occasionally do, but at the end of the day, good art is something you just kind of notice subconsciously. A contentious proposition. To some degree, I feel that I'm of two minds about this comment. For one, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with the idea that we're not expecting to find a specific answer here. It's not going to be that we can give you an exact formula to make something resonate with people. There's all sorts of reasons for that aren't this. For example, the market is just mercurial, and a lot of art being well appreciated nowadays is it finding an audience in an oversaturated market. Therefore, simply being able to be located by its potential audience is meaningfully random, but also involves lots of things that just don't have anything to do with the art being good, like you having a giant pile of money. And so, sure, like we would already expect it to be that even a theoretically perfect answer to what makes art meaningful to people would work surprisingly inconsistently if you tried to apply it in practice. Knowing the answer to this is then not very valuable in one sense. You need a balanced approach if you want to make a successful piece of art, and then if you were to then switch your personality completely and care only about making good art after being able to successfully publish art, then sure, you might be able to reasonably reliably make people works, but we would expect to still not have a high success rate. That is due to emergent properties from combining all this stuff in a piece of art. I completely agree with. Like, yeah, that definitely is why, in practice, this analysis on its own will not give you extremely consistently good works of art, because there are some emergent properties when you combine things. However, I am definitely rejecting this idea that it is something you just kind of notice subconsciously, like inherently. In practice for now, maybe, but to an extent, I have a lot of faith in analysis, in good analysis, where you're willing to push beyond what people take as a given and not just say it's subjective, but like look at the contents of that subjectivity. I think you can piece it together with its constituent parts, and it would just be very hard to do that, but not impossible to do that. I feel like I've gotten renewed faith in that process recently, actually. So I don't know. I am skeptical of that. I don't think I completely agree, if I'm understanding correctly. But I definitely acknowledge the inviolable point that, yeah, we're not expecting it to be that reliable. And it does matter a lot when you combine a lot of elements. Now, this is still really important for video games because it's one of the biggest pitfalls of the industry. A way I think is really interesting to think about entertainment is how compound it is. So something like spoken word poetry or me playing an acoustic guitar is not very compound entertainment. There are not that many different things in it. Then a movie is maybe made up of more parts. You might have a soundtrack, actors, some CGI, lots of parts. You know what a movie is. You can probably see where I'm going with this. Video games are essentially the most so far compound form of art, I would argue. They involve the mostly unrelated disciplines or some of the most. There are other very compound. Movies are a pretty compound form of art too. And I think it's worth noting that historically, compound art is pretty popular. Having a piece of art have all these elements is very popular. I would argue that basically movies, or like TV and movies, and then video games are the two most popular overall human entertainment forms by a rather large margin. I'm not speaking statistically, just like overall cultural impact. And I feel like the humans orbit around preferring those the most in general. I don't know if that's completely true. That's just a claim I'm making. And I think the reason is that compound art is fun. I would say it is somewhat proof then that humans consider it to be an acceptable trade-off that the art is going to be less focused, less united by my own term, and more subject to the woes of emergence in exchange for some benefit. And I think that some of that benefit is the emergence again. It does have to deal with combining all those elements, but it gets a lot of benefits from combining all those elements. It does have to deal with needing to get more parts in concert, but it has more elements as well, so there's potentially more for the audience to like. Another way to think of it is that if your standards are relatively lower, not low, this is not an insult to people, if your standards are relatively reasonable, let's say it that way, then compound art is more likely to contain enough stuff that you like while still getting the benefit of emergence being positive. There will be elements that are sort of more than the sum of their parts, while only having the pitfall that were you to be open to an emotional peak, it's harder to achieve one here because it's very hard to unite a compound piece of art, if you follow that. I think, going back to something earlier from the parlay, there's an important detail here about human ability to experience emotional peaks. Just like other entertainment, as I laid out, I think it's worth considering that being vulnerable to some emotional impact on you requires a lot of materials, which a lot of people either don't have or don't let out when they experience things. And therefore, yeah, the 10-minute game that is the best 10 minutes of your life or whatever, I think for a lot of people, they simply will not use the materials they have with them to have that emotional peak in 10 minutes. There are people who will. There will be people who are ready for that. I know I've had moments where I felt about the biggest emotional impact I ever feel from something when my session experiencing it was very short. That is, it wasn't a 2-hour movie. It was like, I would say the shortest one I can think of is I read a webcomic while taking a shit for about 7 minutes. And I cried a little bit, emotionally moved by the subject in the webcomic. It made me feel encouraged about human tenacity and admire my fellow people. And I could not be happier that that experience happened in that time. I'm not trying to brag either, just to say that I do feel like that requires materials. Privilege is how I think of it as. I mean, I get to spend all day talking about this stuff. So sure, I'm the person who's going to bring their materials to have an emotional peak when I go take a crap. And not everybody is in that place. And that's like fine. It's fine. That's expected and fine. I'm not even sure if we were to zoom out, and this is totally not the topic of this parlay, that you even could have a society mostly full of people who could bring those materials for such an immediate level emotional peak to occur. That is not likely. I don't know how you would get society to be that way. That is beyond a utopia in terms of being idyllic. So I do think that's really relevant here, that there's an element where if the trade-off with compound entertainment is that you lose, it's much harder for it to be united to express its purpose, but you get the benefits of the emergence and there will be like enough stuff that people enjoy. That's a good trade-off for a general public that will probably not have emotional peaks as readily, and isn't as good of a trade-off for people that are ready to have those emotional peaks, because it's not necessary to then flip it around and say, well, you need to like more of it. If your standards are relatively too high, hi there, then you now need to like more elements, and it's harder to get them united for a certain purpose, for not clearly more of an emotional peak in a video game. But I do think that some emergence benefits somewhat make up for that. When it's done well, yeah, I feel like some of the bigger emotional impact I've had has been from video games. Not only there have been other art forms that have done it for me, but there's a reason I'm more focused on video games. It's not just because it's my career, it's a chicken and egg thing. I was already more, confident in video games as an art form. I considered others. I almost went to college for music production. Anyway, I think very relevant, the emergence thing. I just kind of disagree about. It depends what you mean by, at the end of the day, good art is something you just kind of notice subconsciously. I mean, there are causes. We live in a causal universe. I'm not trying to nitpick that, yes, in practice, it's going to be quite difficult to fully comprehend that in a given situation. But that it is comprehensible is important to me. I'll leave it there. It may not be to you, and that's fine. So why care about the invisible wall then? It's not that art automatically becomes good when you try to break the wall. In fact, according to my unitedness property and this thing about compound art almost automatically becomes bad when you try to break the wall until proven good, because you're making it harder to succeed at having everything be unified or whatever. And so what gives? That would make you think that things that go beyond the invisible wall correlate with being bad or worse, I guess, than other work. So what gives if that has not been Mr. Food and my experience? And the unique works are often better. It's more that when people have something to say, they sometimes cannot express that stuff properly. They then try to create art, but it is like there is an invisible wall separating them from the thing they want to express. And when they invest the effort into solving the problem, they sometimes break through that wall and create something that could have existed all along, but didn't because nobody bothered to break it down. Amazing. In other words, we've got a chicken and the egg situation. Rather than thinking that these games come from people seeking new mechanics, it's that these games come from trying to make a purpose-built thing and unite it under that purpose. The game developer then looks around to see what mechanics and game elements would unite the game under the purposes, the things it's trying to express. They look among the things that have existed in game design, and at times, if they are perfectly philosophically meditation plane equally open to every possibility and every game mechanic, and they will do whatever they see as serving the game's purpose, they will, on occasion, look among the game mechanics they've seen in the world and not find it. They will not find something that fits the purpose as closely as they can imagine in the white area of the chart. They will then go into the gray area. But the key thing is, just going into the gray area for no reason seems like it makes art worse without any clear purpose. It just increases the ceiling of how good the art can be, while very likely also making the floor worse by making it more complicated to get everything united. However, the people actually going past the invisible wall are essentially only people who are looking for, the way I've written it in my notes, is a custom solution for their game. They have an idea for the game they want to make. They want to express things in a certain way. And if they are willing, as equally as possible, I guess this makes you a better artist, to use any solution that fits the bill, they will sometimes just look, the thing they'll think of will be outside the invisible wall, and then they will go do it. So the reason that things that push new boundaries in game design are usually good, if you agree with that premise, is because hardly anyone does those things except when they want that custom solution, because it's just way harder. If you don't have any particular reason why you want to make a game one way or another, you simply won't do things beyond the invisible wall. Why? It's much harder to do. It makes things harder to do. It is worse unless you have something in mind. And so the examples we have are only from games and developers or directors of games that wanted one of those things and had a clear purpose for it. You can also imagine on a more mundane level that if you propose making some weird mechanic to your fellow developers and you can explain specifically what role it fills in the game, they're more likely to do it and be willing to put the effort into that. And, having a unique thing in the market. It's a mixed bag for marketing. But I think that I completely agree with you. I think that's exactly it. Originally, Mr. Foot says, I thought that it's the exploration beyond the invisible wall, all the people hammering away at it, that created all these unique pieces of art. But it's the other way around. The pieces are unique because their intent was strong enough that they had no choice but to go beyond the invisible wall. And in theory, this means that you'll occasionally find these equally amazing works, but they will be using familiar design. They will look around and equally willing to use any design that fits the bill. It may happen that that design is already popular, but simply not used in as united of a piece as the game they're going to make. And if they are a perfectly unbiased person who wants the best for their game, they will just use that. And sometimes those games are really good. We get a really overdone thing, like a roguelike, and personally, I find that sometimes when I play roguelikes, they just have a very clearly better idea for using that gameplay loop than just we make a roguelike and there's a ton of roguelikes. It seems like they thought about it this way, but it just happens that a game mechanic that fits their purpose well was common already. And so it doesn't have the exact same impact, but it's still, really interesting. That's why I think this topic is worth caring about, not the roguelike thing. This is Mr. Foot again. You can think of it as the opposite of tropes and cliches. They're like a visible wall. And people who use them in their stories, people who metaphorically run into very visible walls, tend to look very silly. Fair enough. I like the idea that this is a sort of reverse trope. These are the pieces that will be the least cliche, or they're the opposite of cliche, because they were specifically exploring this custom solution to their problem. And therefore you'll get a game not just with unique mechanics, which just as an aside, that doesn't really matter, right? That could just be sort of annoying. It's unfamiliar, but for no reason, that's bad. It could at least be familiar. And indeed, I think part of why games that are a little bit more mediocre and not as united in their purpose are still pretty fun is because the learning curve is lower. They usually don't do this custom solution thing, so you don't have to learn them as much. Maybe being able to skip tutorials is an important feature in games. Anyway, go figure. But because when you find those unique mechanics, statistically, they will usually be purpose-built into the game. So when a game has weird things that you're doing, more of the time, the motivation to make the game be about those weird things is that they fit the game really well, and you will feel like that's part of the experience. It will be better incorporated and in a more united experience that sort of promises more. It is therefore more worth learning a new experience. Something outside of your comfort zone is somewhat likely to be more impactful for you, simply because if it requires that you learn more, and I mean a reasonable amount of people are enjoying it, this means that the payoff was worth it to a lot of people. And so it doesn't mean it needs to be like popular, but if you know of a game and it's made it decently, then enough people have played it, paid more of a cost up front to learn it, but then consider that cost to be worthwhile once they finish playing it, and therefore it's likely to be good. I think, sure. Very interesting conclusion to the series, where it's kind of bad to go beyond the invisible wall unless you do it the opposite way. You have that as a tool in your toolbox, and you do it when it makes sense. Now, it would be very interesting indeed to try to find a way to reliably make novel games beyond the invisible wall, but not motivated by this process. I don't think that that is impossible. As you said, there's an emergence thing going on here. This was a relatively complicated topic. I only just barely fit it into 45 minutes, and I talked nonstop for that entire time while you wrote a very good script for this parlay, a very particularly nice one, by the way. Well done. I thought that was a really well put conclusion for you. And I was delighted to hear such a satisfying come full circle. Ha ha ha, boo, ha. The parlay's almost over, don't worry, at the end of the series. But still, I think it's really worth considering, okay, but it's not like that. Those are just the reasons why it correlates that when you make a new game, most people will only be motivated to do that and have it be good if it's a purpose-built solution, like a custom solution for the game design they want. That doesn't mean that you can't deliberately make games with new mechanics and have them be reliably good. You could do that. This just means most people are not motivated that way, and so that's not what you'll expect to see in the general public. But now that we've had this conversation, let's finish this up. One more thought. What's the meaning of it all? So one more time, what is good art? Mr. Foot says, to me, it's a conversation. And I love having conversations with people that are passionate. I love having conversations that give me a new perspective. I love having conversations that separate my life into a before and after. What a nice line. There is this saying that when you lack the words to express something, you should sing it instead. In some ways, art is the ultimate conversation. It can be a nugget of wisdom a person has honed over decades, expressed in a way that is easily understandable to anyone that bothers experiencing it, when done well, certainly. At the time, Nier Automata was a conversation that I really needed to have. I hope that I will continue to have lots of these interesting conversations in the future, and I hope that this series has provided y'all with some tools to understand how to make good art in the future. And I only hope that there are people who are going to take that as inspiration other than, definitely me. This has significantly affected my opinions about game design myself, and I definitely started doing these parlay years ago, feeling differently about game design than I do now that I'm done. I think I even started this parlay feeling a little different about game design than I do after it's done. So very well done. I think we really managed to conclude something, not really put the topic to bed at all. I think the good thing about Yoko Taro bringing it up is that this is barely a thing people are deliberately exploring in game design. Again, a lot of people, I feel, are thinking about novelty in game design and game mechanics, but for the egg before the chicken reason, because they want to make something new, which we've concluded probably won't straightforwardly work, though I'm confident that with applying ourselves, we probably could find a way to make that go much better. I just don't, this is no shade to the industry. I don't personally think that that's what we're going to get for a little while. This parlay, as I've said quite a few times over its duration, the many parlay in this series, also comes at a really interesting time where I feel like the general public is gaining knowledge about game development, and therefore there are people taking more risks, in my view, to an extent. The indie scene popping off is lowering the barrier to take those risks. But also, I feel like we've seen some really good work in sort of the exact opposite direction of this Parley series, which is game design formulas getting brought back to and sort of added to in a meaningful and effective way more than in the past. At least that's my opinion. I'm not, that's very hard to objectify. But there are a lot of things where I feel like you can see it's a very old gameplay formula, but now it was seeing it with new eyes and adding something to it that you could have added all along, but game design simply didn't think of it that way for a while. In most cases, it's not like a technical limitation, for example. I think that's important. We're at a period of time where Yoko Taro's idea that some things are just impossible to make, not very many currently. Even if you're a solo dev, it's pretty astonishing how little limitation you have a lot of the time. And people's computers are, powerful enough. It's the simple stuff like that, such that you can kind of just make things. To me, a kind of landmark example of this is weirdly Vampire Survivors, where there's a lot of enemies on screen and it, lags still, but that just wouldn't be able to happen in such a blunt way without computers the way they were. And therefore the weird roguelike auto attacker bullet heaven is what that genre has been called sometimes. Not a bullet hell where you avoid all the bullets, but a bullet heaven where you are the bullet hell. I've heard that genre referred to. That's cute. It wasn't possible in the same way until recently. And so if there were these tools, until recently, a lot of them were in the black area, not in the gray area. And recently, many of them have drifted into that area. And I would also argue that has mostly subsided now. There's very little black area beyond just completely different activities than, I gave VR games as an example, but that's kind of a different thing. That black area is very small if you plan to make conventional video games, in my opinion. I'm not encouraging people to make taboo sexual content in their game, but I think Yoko Taro's comment that those are the games that are in the black area, I kind of disagree. Like, I feel like we mostly have all of that stuff, actually. But that comment was from 2014, so fair enough. And mostly in the last 10 years, okay, so whatever, I guess. Porn games on Steam, But let's not end this long series of Parley with a mention of porn games on Steam. Let's instead end it with some pithy philosophical, we already did that. It's been an interesting ride. Yeah, I'm very curious to see how you'll react to this Parley being done, because it sounds to me like you want to go from thing to thing. We had a Parley a few ago, if you enjoyed this one, folks. We had one or two ago that was about where you think the next horizon for the invisible wall will be. Like, what will be the next games that create new emotional peaks, at least for you and for a lot of people who've played a lot of these games. And you posited that it will be these games that have a kind of meta impact on you in some new way, or do something with context, or like creating their own sort of artificial context. We talked about fictional art within art, or art that doesn't really exist, but art is referencing something that could exist but doesn't explicitly. And you can manipulate this to create a lot of, I'm describing it as context, without necessarily having to set up all that context. If you want to bring it to my model, where the audience comes with their materials and the work asks for certain materials to enjoy it, and then you go on a ride. This frontier is creating virtual materials for the audience, giving them perspectives that kind of don't exist, sort of hacking the perspectives into existence, and then using them for now, and then moving back on. I think this is a very interesting idea. I definitely think that manipulating perspective, even just mundanely, is really interesting. And some of the experiences I've had over the course of this Parley, some of the media you've shown me, have done that. It's really interesting what happens in that one comic from that criticized mangaka, where the kid is showing like his mother dying from an illness, and then she's on her deathbed, and he's walking away from the hospital, and the hospital explodes, and he walks away, and we zoom out, and it's like a movie he edited for his high school or something, and all the students in the audience are like, what am I watching right now? And then for the rest of it, obviously the mangaka knows this, you're gonna feel like, are we gonna zoom out again? And that type of, you kind of gave the audience a unique material that manipulates how they experience the work in the work. It tutorialized was how I described that earlier. I think there's a lot to be explored in that area of design. And, you know, I do have my own pithy thing to say at the end, I guess. If you're gonna say, I hope this has provided people with tools to make good art in the future. Game developers, currently, a lot of games, many of the games I've played recently that came out recently, have pretty long tutorials, but for familiar systems. This seems like a good time, if people are willing to accept that, to try having a game that makes you do something kind of weird, but just put a lot of effort into the tutorial process. Because for many games, you kind of have to go through a boring, unless you have happened to not play other games like a tutorial before. And the industry is often full of people who are new to a thing, so it's weird. A lot of games have been, this is a familiar formula, so we'll stick to that. But gaming is reaching new markets currently. Isn't it a good time to do a formula that isn't familiar, because a lot of the people playing are not that familiar with games anyway, and just do a good job tutorializing it? I've been delighted to see some games that released recently that had tutorials go back and fix the tutorial, pay attention to the early part of the game instead, and invest in that a little bit more. I personally, maybe it's confirmation bias, felt like that did not happen anywhere near enough in the past. People got very obsessed with, well, we can't make a new update for the existing audience if we don't keep pushing forward, therefore we won't go back and make the core of the game good. At least for me, there have been some landmark examples of games taking the time to do that and it paying off. Another example is Warframe that comes to mind after many, many years, over almost a decade. Finally coming back and sort of sorting out like damage types and modding and armor scaling, and not perfectly necessarily. I'm not sure how good I feel about that overall as far as the results, but the idea that they did it, definitely a sensible thing to do, that I feel like games have kind of undersold for a while. I think people know enough in our globalized society that they have perspective to see that something is just good. If you just make something cool and good, it can that can be the thing that makes people want to play it. Being united matters. It doesn't just have to be this like showy, eye-catching thing. It has an effect when a game is united in some way, and it doesn't feel like, what am I doing? Doesn't feel directionless in a given moment. So indeed, it's a very interesting time to be doing this for a living. In some ways, I feel like Parley itself wouldn't really be able to exist if we weren't talking about something like video games significantly. Not all Parley are about that, but with that as the core or backdrop, game theory at least, or design as the backdrop. But then also that it is this time in human history where like there's a lot happening with that subject, and a relatively large number of people have some experience with it. So you came at a very good time and made it a very good experience. Mr. Foot, I know we're doing that one other thing. Keep an eye out for the next Parley for Mr. Foot, but thank you for this series. It was a lot of fun. I didn't think that when we started this, there would be Parley that were like a 2-year series. Obviously, I'm not that self-centered, so I'm very thankful that this existed, that somebody decided to use this service to make this involved thing. And you can too. I'm completely confident saying absolutely no fear that this will go horribly awry. Link in the description. We'd love to have you. Start your own series if you like. We'd love to have you. Again, you can also just ask a simple thing, like a normal Q&A thing, and maybe grow a series out of that. I would be interested to see what that would be like. You can talk about whatever you want in your prompts, and I'll give you a chunk of time where I discuss them, chew on them with you. That's in the description. We'd love to have you. Looking forward to the next one.